Scientists calculated the geographic center of all Earth's landmasses, every continent, every island, averaged together. The answer came back central Turkey. Not Europe, not the broader Middle East, Turkey. And for over 1,000 years, cartographers from the 8th century through the 1780s agreed without knowing each other. They all placed the Garden of Eden in that same region. Then, around the 1800s, those maps started to change, and the old ones quietly disappeared. It began with a single map, a 1780 map drawn by a Welsh cartographer named Thomas Bowen. His father was Emmanuel Bowen, official mapmaker to King George II of England and King Louis XV of France. These were not men who made guesses. Their entire reputation depended on accuracy. On Thomas Bowen's map, a region in eastern Turkey is labeled terrestrial paradise, not in Iraq, not in Iran. In a province of modern Turkey most people today would struggle to find, Elazig. One researcher spent over a year cross-referencing that map against dozens of other historical maps, the Bible, geological records, and satellite imagery. What he found didn't just challenge the mainstream answer about where Eden was, it made the mainstream answer look like it came from a completely different set of coordinates. This is that story, and by the end of it, you may look at a map of Turkey very differently than you do right now. Most people, if you ask them, will say the Garden of Eden was in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. It's the answer schools teach, documentaries repeat, and encyclopedias confirm. But there's a problem with that answer. Genesis 2 is actually quite specific. It says a single river flowed out of Eden and then split into 4. Those 4 rivers were the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Pishon, and the Gihon. If Eden was in Iraq, Iraq is where those rivers would need to originate. They don't. The Tigris and Euphrates don't start in Iraq, they end there. Both rivers begin far to the north, in the elevated highlands of eastern Turkey, the region historically known as the Armenian Highlands, and flow south toward Iraq. The Bible says the rivers flow out of Eden. That means Eden is at the source, not the destination. That single observation moved the location from Iraq to Turkey, but the maps go much further. Real quick, to everyone who keeps coming back, a genuine thank you. It really does mean a lot. As always, everything I share here is the best of what I've been able to find and piece together. If something sits differently with what you know, please don't take it personally, and neither will I. Think of me as someone who reads a lot, but certainly hasn't read everything. Nothing I present here is the final word. Evidence changes, understanding shifts. I'd far rather be honestly uncertain than confidently wrong. Now, let's keep going. When you look at historical maps, not just one or two, but dozens of them, something becomes very clear very quickly. From the 8th century through the late 1700s, they all point to the same place. An 8th century map, one of the oldest surviving world maps ever found, shows Eden inside Armenia. A 1467 map labels eastern Turkey as Armenia Minor. A 1569 map of the same region draws Eden encircled by mountains, 4 rivers flowing outward from its center, labeled Armenia Major. Abraham Ortelius, one of the most respected cartographers in all of European history, produced a map in the 1500s placing Eden clearly in eastern Turkey. On his map, the word Mesopotamia covers modern Georgia, Armenia, and eastern Turkey, not Iraq. A 1704 map calls the region the Garden of Earthly Delights. And on Bowen's 1780 map, when you overlay it onto modern satellite imagery, the geography lines up in a way that's difficult to dismiss. The Taurus Mountains, still there, still with the same name, sit directly south of the labeled paradise, exactly as shown. And near the town of Malatya, there's a circular depression on the landscape, the ghost of a lake that no longer exists. It sits precisely where Bowen's map shows a lake inside the borders of Eden. Now, a lot of these maps also label this region Armenia, and some people push back on that. They say Armenia is a different country. But look at any map from before 1800. On virtually all of them, Armenia covers both modern Armenia and most of eastern Turkey. Even today, the mountains of eastern Turkey are still called the Armenian Highlands. A map from ancient Herodotus suggests that virtually all of Turkey may once have carried that name. So when old maps say Eden was in Armenia, they are pointing at eastern Turkey, every time. At the northernmost point of the terrestrial paradise on Bowen's map, there's a label that deserves its own moment: Ophir. In the Bible, Ophir is where King Solomon sourced most of his gold. Go to that exact location today, the Erzincan region at the northern edge of the Elazig province, and you will find the largest active gold mine in the entire country of Turkey. It's called Kaplar Altın Madeni, and they are pulling gold out of the ground there right now. Genesis says there is gold at the edge of Eden. A cartographer in 1780 places Ophir, Solomon's gold, at the northern edge of paradise, and modern geology confirms the largest gold deposit in Turkey sits in that precise spot. And just look at the town names around it: Erzincan, Erzurum. The word Erz in German means ore, metal ore. Erzurum was also historically known for copper and silver mining. The language of the land itself seems to remember what was there. But it doesn't stop at gold. The province of Tunceli, just north of Elazig, was once called Derzem. In Persian, Derzem means silver gate. There are old legends that describe paradise as having gates made of precious metals. And here sits a province called Silver Gate, right at the edge of where old maps draw those borders. The name Elazig itself traces back to the Arabic word Aziz, meaning the Almighty, a name for God. On a 1500s map by Abraham Ortelius, at the very center of the Eden province, a city is labeled Najd. In ancient Arabic and Persian, Najd carries meanings: pure, immaculate, beauty, star, bright. The city at the center of paradise carries a name that sounds exactly like what people have always imagined paradise to be. Then there's the word Armenia in ancient German, where Ar meant earth and men simply meant men. Armenia, men of earth, the old name for the place where old maps say humanity began. And then there's something almost amusing. In German, the word Tor means door, which would make Tor key, the door and the key. Whether that's a linguistic coincidence or something more, you can decide for yourself. But when this many details across this many languages all point to the same conclusion, it starts to feel less like coincidence. This is the part that stays with you. If you go looking for maps of this region from the 1100s to the late 1400s, one of the most heavily mapped areas in the entire medieval world, you find almost nothing. Nearly every result turns out to be a modern reproduction of an old map, not an original. Real maps from those 400 years from this region are essentially gone. And then a map turned up, labeled as a 1330s document from the period when the Mongol-Tartarian Empire controlled this area. On that map, no mention of Eden anywhere, none. But upon investigation, that 1330s map was found to have been drawn in the 1880s, a document with a false date, replacing a period when Eden was still clearly marked on original maps, showing a version of history where Eden simply does not exist. That's not a theory about intent. That's a forged date on a historical document, and the gradual shift is visible in the maps that did survive. A 1783 map moves paradise slightly south and east, closer to Iraq. A later map moves it a little more. Over decades, the location drifted, degree by degree, until eventually the mainstream answer settled on Iraq. There's also a mountain worth mentioning. On Bowen's map, just outside the southern borders of paradise, there's a label, Babylonia. According to the Bible, Babylonia was ruled by Nimrod, an adversary of God. At that exact distance from the Elazig region today, there is a mountain in Turkey called Mount Nimrit, in English, Mount Nimrod, right outside the gates, exactly where the old map puts it. One last thing, and this one is hard to shake. The actual mathematical center of all Earth's landmasses, calculated using digital terrain models and satellite data, falls in central Turkey. The actual mathematical center of the world's land, in Turkey.
in the same region that centuries of mapmakers working independently across a span of 1,000 years called the Garden of Eden. So, was the Garden of Eden in Turkey? The researcher who put this together is 70% sure it was centered in the Elazığ province specifically, and 100% sure it falls within the broader region of eastern Turkey, possibly stretching into Armenia, Georgia, or Azerbaijan. And what's genuinely hard to argue with is the weight of evidence as a whole. The biblical rivers originate in eastern Turkey. Hundreds of historical maps across 10 centuries agree on the same location. The gold mine called Ophir still exists there. The place names across Arabic, Persian, German, and Kurdish all echo the same story. A circular lake bed sits exactly where old maps draw a lake. Mount Nimrod sits exactly where old maps place Babylonia. And the geometric center of Earth's land is in that same region. The mainstream answer, Eden and Iraq, arrived late, spread fast, and replaced a far older consensus. Maybe that older consensus deserves another look. And maybe the most interesting question isn't where Eden was. Maybe it's why the maps that showed us exactly where it was seem to have gone missing. If this made you think, share it with someone, and check out the other videos on this channel while you're here.